We have been, over the past few weeks, we've been in this little series that has to do with getting to know Jesus better, being taught about Jesus, and really trying to focus on Jesus. I think we've learned a lot thus far, but as we've been doing that, we've been trying to learn and focus on Jesus by asking two different questions. Those questions are, as we study Jesus, we look at His life, we look at His ministry. The questions are, what are we learning about Jesus? But then, what do we learn from Jesus? I think when you follow that method of study when looking at Jesus, I think that you get a lot from it. Because what it does, it forces you to slow down and try to answer those questions as you're looking at Jesus, and you can kind of see or ask, okay, what's He doing? How does He react with things? What is His approach? What does Jesus say at times? But then really trying to invite some of those things into our lives and try to apply those things to us. And as I've said before, I think we look more like Jesus when we just try to do the things that Jesus did. When we pay attention to the actions that He took and the things that He said, and if we just try and model those things, we're going to look a whole lot more like Jesus, which is the goal, and that's what we want. But when we are trying to look at Jesus, it is not just with the actions we see or the things that He says. Sometimes we can also look like Jesus even in our emotions. Even in our emotions. Of all of the human qualities that Jesus had, and traits that we see, love and anger and zeal and sadness and even frustration at times, the one that may portray His humanity the most might be the compassion that we see in Him. Where Jesus is moved because of something that He sees in someone else's life. I think when we see that side of Jesus, it almost feels like it connects us that much more to Jesus. Or Jesus is maybe connected to us that much more, because maybe we don't always see Jesus in that way. We often see Jesus as, He's the Son of God. He's the one that works miracles. And we don't sometimes maybe see Jesus in this way. But when you see Him deeply moved in spirit, it says, because He sees all of these people crying over the death of Lazarus, and He begins to weep. Or when you read that Jesus saw the mother of her dead son crying as these men carried him out of the city of Nain, it says that Jesus saw her and He felt compassion for her. You feel that when you read something like that. Or maybe when you see Him concerned about the people that were following Him around during His ministry because they were hungry. And He did not want to send them away because they might literally faint along the way. And you read that Jesus had compassion for them. You feel that. Inside of you, you feel that. And you feel that because compassion and being moved is something very real that we often feel for people too. We're moved when we see other people weeping over the death of a loved one. How do you go to a funeral and you not shed a tear because you see the wife or somebody else crying over their loved one that's lost and gone now. It's hard not to cry. Our hearts sometimes go out to those that may struggle to eat. They are hungry, or when we even see children that are starving and they are hungry and they are in need of food or clothing, compassion then becomes a very real emotion for us, and it's something that we see in Jesus as well. Last week, we touched on something very briefly in Mark chapter 1 as we were discussing this idea of modeling Jesus in our busyness. As we were talking about some of the people that had come to Jesus, some of those that he had interactions with, and I briefly mentioned the leper that had come to him. Okay, you remember that toward the end of Mark chapter 1, the leper that comes to Jesus? I briefly mentioned that, and we didn't really talk much about that, but I want to this morning. Because this, I think, is another instance where we can learn about Jesus and learn something from Jesus through the compassion that we see in Jesus with this particular occurrence with the leper. The incident occurred when Jesus went to some neighboring towns of Galilee. He was going to go there and preach. And as he was there, you read in chapter 1, this is 39 through 41, but you read that he says he went out preaching in their synagogues throughout all Galilee and casting out the demons. And verse 40 begins and says, "And a leper came to Jesus, pleading with him and falling on his knees before him and saying, 'If you are willing, you can make me clean.' And moved with compassion, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said, 'I am willing, be cleansed.'" It's quite moving when you read that, honestly. Especially when you consider how isolated people with leprosy were back in that time. There was not a lot of contact with other people outside of those that also may have had leprosy. And it was a very contagious disease. It was. And very rarely did people heal or recover from it. But the point is, if they had it, they were deemed unclean. Unclean. And anything the leprosy touched was also unclean. Even if another person had contact with them, they too would now be deemed unclean. That's according to the law of Moses. Okay? Remember, Jesus is still under the law as he is operating. But all that is under the law of Moses, okay? But we learn something about Jesus with this encounter, something about compassion. And that's what I want us to focus on this morning. You've got this man coming to Jesus who is ceremonially unclean according to the law. Yet we learn that Jesus is not turned off by uncleanness. Now, this isn't the only time that you read about Jesus coming into contact with a person that was unclean. Really, he was around people that were unclean kind of on like 3 different levels, if you will. You had folks that were unclean either ceremonially, morally perhaps, and maybe just socially. But Jesus had no problem being around these people. Jesus had no problem being around the lepers. It says that he healed at least 10 of them in Luke chapter 17. You've also got in Mark chapter 5, you remember the woman who had the hemorrhage for like 12 years, this bleeding that she kept on having. Well, it says that she goes up and touches Jesus. Well, and then she becomes clean because of that. You've also got in Mark chapter 5, Jairus' daughter in that same chapter that was pronounced dead, whom they tell Jesus about him, and Jesus goes to the house and he takes her by the hand and tells her to arise, and he brought her back. Well, all of those people were ceremonially unclean according to the law of Moses. And then you see Jesus around those who were considered the outcast, if you will. These, because of the way that they lived their lives, these were the ones who were deemed the sinners, right? The ones that hung out with the tax collectors, those. Jesus dines with both of them on one occasion, including Matthew, who had them all over to his house at one time. Not to mention, Jesus hung out with the chief of the tax collectors in Luke 19. Remember Zacchaeus? He says, I'm going to spend time in your house today, Zacchaeus. I'm going to hang out with you. Jesus spent time with them, but the religious elites definitely saw them as morally unclean, which is why they're quite confused, and they're asking Jesus, what are you doing hanging out with all the tax collectors and sinners, Jesus? What are you doing there? That's not what we do. You're a man of God. We don't hang out with tax collectors and sinners. And then Jesus is also around those who really were just socially looked down upon. The blind, the lame, and the sick. And he had healed all kinds of people with various diseases, but a lot of those people were those that the Pharisees and scribes may not have had much to do with, or anybody really would have had much to do with. They were just a segment of people that were just often overlooked. But it didn't matter how unclean any of those people were. It never affected Jesus whatsoever being around them. He was not turned off by them being unclean. And it surely didn't affect his compassion, even for this leper. So how do we apply something like this? Well, let's talk metaphorically for a second. Metaphorically, I think you could make the application that sin could be compared to uncleanness. To be clear, though, in the law, just because something was deemed unclean did not inherently make it sinful. We need to understand that. But metaphorically speaking, sin can be compared to that which is unclean. Now, the chances of you ever coming into contact with somebody who has leprosy is probably pretty low. In your lifetime, you probably won't ever come into contact with somebody who has this disease. However, the chances of you coming into contact with someone who has the soul-eating disease of sin in their life, that's 100%. 100%. You will, without a doubt, come into contact with somebody who is unclean. You will. And with that in mind, I think we can learn something from Jesus here with his compassion. And I think we can learn that if we're talking about sin, if we're talking about this uncleanness idea, we should never let sin hinder our compassion. This man with leprosy came to Jesus, and it moved him. It moved him. And so he cleansed the man. When it comes to the sin that people have in their lives, I don't think that we should ever allow that to affect us coming into contact with them. Especially if they're going to come to us. I don't think it should keep us away from them. But especially if they're going to come to us like the leper came to Jesus. I think sometimes, though, it is hard. It is hard for Christians to sometimes allow themselves to be around people and their difficult situations. I think it is sometimes challenging for them to offer up help for a person that has quite a bit of sin in their life. It's hard, number one, because we may not be used to dealing with such situations. We don't know how to deal with some situations that we find. It's also hard because there might be sacrifice that is involved. There might be money that needs to be involved and time as well. It all gets very difficult to handle, and sin in the lives of people can get them into a pretty bad spot. I mean, this stuff can be messy, very messy. But if somebody was to approach you who is in a sinful situation, whatever it may be, they've got sin in their life, they are unclean, so to speak, yet they're trying to get help, what response are you going to have? Think about that. I wonder how many times this man may have gotten close in proximity to other people, and they were just disgusted with him, or maybe even purposefully avoided him so that they didn't have to get close to him. I wonder how many times people were moved with disgust because of his disease. Did you know that sometimes the reason why people who may have sin in their life don't just walk up into a church building all the time is because they think that people are going to meet them with disgust, or they think people are going to be disgusted with them? I mean, I've heard this from people. They think that they're not holy enough. They think that they are not worthy enough. The mentality is, how could I ever set foot in a place where all of these righteous people are, where all of these holy people are? They're not going to want anything to do with me. That's the mentality sometimes. And sometimes they feel like they're going to be met with disgust. And listen, I'm not saying this is the case, but just generally, if that's the way that people who are living with sin in their life feel sometimes, I don't think disgust is the right response. I don't think disgust is the right response. I don't think it's the right response if you happen to come into contact with someone who struggles with sin. That's not really going to help the situation, for one. That's not really going to help the person at all. You see, when this leper came to Jesus, it was different. It was different this time. And Jesus wasn't moved with disgust. Jesus was moved with compassion. Therefore, when someone may approach us, their sin, their uncleanness should not hinder our compassion either. And that's true whether people are coming to you out in your daily life or if people walk through those doors back there. It shouldn't hinder our compassion either. Now, it doesn't mean, understand, it doesn't mean that we overlook the sin. It doesn't mean that we set the sin aside and not worry about it, listen, you can acknowledge it without affirming it. And those are two very different things. You can acknowledge it, but it doesn't mean you have to affirm it. And it may have to be dealt with. But you also have to understand that somebody's got to start somewhere. I mean, remember, you started somewhere at some point too, did you not? So you've got to understand that. And so just because somebody may come to you who may have sin in their life doesn't mean that compassion goes out the window. You don't just throw it out. I mean, if somebody, I tried to make this analogy, and I hope this makes sense, but bear with me. If somebody, who was out of shape, maybe they've gotten a little bit overweight or whatever, and they come to a personal trainer. They come to a trainer seeking help to get fit. Well, it's not going to do any bit of good for that trainer to say, sorry, man, you got yourself into this mess. You got yourself into this mess. I'm sorry, I'm not going to help you. You should have thought about this a little bit better. You should have thought about the decisions that you made and your habits that you started having. I'm sorry, I'm not going to help you. That sounds pretty rude, doesn't it? I don't even like hearing myself say it. But yeah, that's not going to go over very well. So, no, the trainer then would at least need to acknowledge, okay, the bad habits that they've gotten into and perhaps have those tough conversations and talk about ways to be better and what they shouldn't do for their health. He doesn't have to affirm their lifestyle, by no means. But then, that trainer would also have to see that, this person paid the money. They're ready to make an effort to come here 3 times a week to get help. And even though they may feel self-conscious about their body and embarrassed about the way that they look, they're making a change in their life. They want to. And so what does the trainer do? He trains them. He helps them. They have compassion for them because they want to see this person get back to a healthier life. I think sometimes it is easy to write people off and say, sorry. That's what happens. That's what happens when you live that life. You get yourself into these situations. Sorry, you reap what you sow. You should have thought about the decisions that you were making. It's easy to write people off, and it's easy to say, especially if you've never really been in their position or haven't necessarily come out of the world and from a broken and sinful life. It's very easy to say that. But I think what helps with having the compassion that we need for people is trying to at least put yourself in their shoes for a moment, or maybe think back to when you were in their shoes for a moment, and you try to think about where the sinner has been, or maybe what they've gone through, or what they are still going through at this moment. You try to empathize a little bit. You obviously can't prove this from the text necessarily, but maybe something that was running through Jesus' mind that sparked this compassion was knowing the hardship that this man must have been going through. I mean, he may have thought about the fact, or not the fact, but he may have thought about maybe how lonely this man is. And that he doesn't have much human contact, again, outside of others that may have had the same disease. He may have thought about the fact that this man, if he was a husband, he's not really able to be around his wife hardly at all. If the man has kids, he's not able to be around his kids at all. I mean, you will pass that on to your family. Absolutely not. So, there is no sitting down at the dinner table and having these nice family meals. He doesn't have that right now. There is no going to the temple to worship. You can't do that. You've got to stay outside. I mean, you remember some of the Old Testament stuff? You had to stay outside the camp. You can't go to the temple to worship even. But you'd have to stay outside and away from everybody else in hopes that you would finally maybe get clean. And even so, then a priest would still have to come and examine and see if you were clean. But maybe he was thinking about those things, and maybe that's what moved him. I don't know. But I do know that sometimes compassion flows out from us when we see life from other people's perspective. Sometimes it flows out of us when we see life from other people's perspective. I think sometimes that right there might break down the wall that we might have that may prevent us from helping them. But when we put ourselves in their shoes, I think we too can be moved with compassion, just like Jesus. I mean, let's try to apply this in a very real way for just a second. Look, when you think about how difficult it is for people to stop giving in to their sin, when you think about how hard it may be to get out from under substance abuse that has held them captive for so long, or when you think about how challenging it is to walk away maybe from a pornography addiction, or how hard it might be to, put down the gauntlet finally and stop being such an angry person all the time. Or you just think about whatever battle they have fought for years and they just can't seem to win. For every time they've tried to do better, they have just as many failures. And they go to bed at night upset with themselves because the same temptation won the day again. You got to think about those things. And when we do consider things like that and think about people and we think about their situations and really even how difficult it is even to work up the courage and acknowledge that they need help, that's what moves us toward the same kind of compassion that we find in Jesus. That's what can move us. Last thing I want us to think about. This leper obviously knew enough about Jesus that he was willing to come close, perhaps closer than he had to anybody. And probably thought that maybe Jesus wouldn't be disgusted with me. Maybe he could help me. Consider that and think about yourself for a moment. Are you the kind of person that someone dealing with sin would think about coming to because they know that they would be met with compassion? Or would they hesitate in fear that they might be met with disgust? Oh, to be like thee, full of compassion, loving, forgiving, tender, and kind, helping the helpless, cheering the fainting, seeking the wandering sinner to find. May our compassion resemble his. Let's stand and sing.